A very warm welcome to today's lunchtime seminar, jointly sponsored by the Centre for Baptist Studies and the Baptist Historical Society. My name's Dr. Chris Joynes. I'm the Director of the Centre for Baptist Studies and Fellow in Theology at Regent's Park College. I'm really delighted you've been able to join us today to celebrate the publication of Andy Goodliff's new monograph, Renewing a Modern Denomination, a study of Baptist institutional life in the 1990s. And I'm going to hand over now to my friend and colleague Keith Jones, President of the Baptist Historical Society, to add his word of welcome.
Thank you very much, Christine. It's a great joy for the Baptist Historical Society to share in this book launch with the Centre for Baptist Studies. So greetings to you from the Society. It's I'm sure all of you are members of it. If you aren't, hopefully by the end of this book launch you will have decided to sign up, and that will be a great thing. In this welcome, obviously I want to welcome Andy especially. Christine's referred to the book that we're launching today. Andy's initial studies took place at King's College London. He trained for the ministry at Regent's Park College in Oxford. For the last 11 years, he's served as minister at Bellevue Baptist Church in Southend-on-Sea. His doctoral studies were done under Stephen Holmes at St Andrews, and Stephen's there somewhere on the pictures, the images on my computer. And the book we're about to launch is based on his doctoral studies and focuses on developments in the Baptist Union of Great Britain in the 1990s. And as you read the story, if people like me who feature at least as footnotes in it, you relive some of the events and think about some of the things that happened during that period. Andy's book seeks to analyse that and to offer perspectives about the theological and missiological thinking that was going on amongst members of the Baptist Union of Great Britain in that period. So it's with great delight that we launch this book today, and we hear from Andy, and then we'll hear from various respondents to the book and have opportunity for questions. I'm going to hand back to Christine now.
Thank you, Keith. I just want to say a few words about practicalities. First of all, to alert you to the fact that the seminar is being recorded and with a view to it being shared online. So there are ways to avoid your presence being known if you so choose by renaming yourself now that you're in the meeting by just your first name if you prefer. But we hope that most of you will feel free to keep your cameras on and be pleased to be seen here celebrating the launch of the book today. Secondly, we would like to just ask all participants to remain muted to avoid background noise interference during the seminar. But during the Q&A time, we will ask you to unmute and ask your own questions. But we'd like to encourage you to use the chat function to indicate that you want to ask a question, and I will then ask you to unmute at the appropriate point of time. In terms of the format of today's event, we're joined by a distinguished group of panellists who are going to be giving their responses to the book, and each of them will speak in turn for about 15 minutes, and Keith and I will introduce them to you in turn. Then Andy will give his response to their comments, again for about 15 minutes. We'll follow that with a very brief stretch break, so you can just look away from the screen for 5 minutes. And then we look forward to a really rich period of Q&A, which I hope you'll all stay to join with us for. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first panellist. Paul Fiddes is a Baptist minister, formerly Principal of Regent's Park College, Oxford, and holds the title of distinction Professor of Systematic Theology at the University of Oxford. He's also recently been elected to a fellowship in the British Academy. In addition to his significant academic work, where he's recognised as one of the foremost contemporary theological thinkers, Paul has played a prominent role within Baptist institutional life. During the period examined by Andy's book, Paul was chair of the Doctrine and Worship Committee of the Baptist Union, chair of the Theological Education Committee of the European Baptist Federation, and chair of the Doctrine Commission of the Baptist World Alliance. So, as Paul himself writes, he got to know a lot about what was going on among Baptists. And I'll hand over to him now to give his response to the book. Thank you, Paul.
Well, thank you, Chris and Andy, for the invitation to respond. Am I audible? Good.
Yes.
Well, Andy's book has given me the kind of gift that one might expect from eternity. I mean, being able to relive past events with at least the hope of redeeming the past. And I must say at the beginning that this book is an achievement which I appreciate and admire. Andy's right to select the decade of the 1990s as a key one in the whole history of the Baptist movement in the UK, and I think that future historians will confirm his judgment. They'll also never be able to do without his pioneering work, to which he's brought clear sight and sharp analysis. He deftly combines close attention to written documents, a survey of movements, and the drawing of personality portraits. He traces the detail of texts and also the sweep of influence over the years. I believe he's right in his basic thesis, that the success of one particular trend in the 1990s has had its outworking in the present trend of denationalizing the denomination. Nothing else I want to say as a participant in these events related should underline the fact that this book is essential reading for all who care about Baptist studies and identity. But I know that he'd want me to raise questions, and I'm going to do so in a supportive spirit. The first question, I think, is over the basic division of the movements of thought and action in the period into two streams of renewal, named denominational building and theological renewal, respectively. It's a good lens, and it does enable close examination, as all lenses do. It's a way of looking, and in its own way, it is convincing. But of course, Andy himself registers its limits, in that the participants in each movement do share the concerns of the other. While the theological trend is shaped by the idea of covenant, and the denominational trend by a passion for mission, yet the two overlap all the time. Paul Beasley Murray's Radical Believers, a book from the mainstream stable, considers church membership as a covenant relationship, as Andy notes on page 32. I might also cite a letter from my own files in which Douglas McBain, doyen of the first movement, thanks me for the attention given to covenant in the document on the nature of council and assembly, and praises what he calls consistent theological development for the Baptist Union. On the other hand, what we might call the Covenant Group for Theological Renewal base their thinking on a vision of the mission of God, as Andy makes clear. The 4 college principals within the group were involved in building deeper structural relations between the colleges and their neighboring associations. They also engaged in conversation with the mission department of the Union to try to integrate research in practical theology within the colleges with the work of the department. One of them, Brian Hames, chaired the report into superintendents, to which Andy gives quite a lot of attention. All this surely comes under the heading of denominational building. Another way of looking at the issue would be to say that there were 2 different theologies, 2 different ecclesiologies going on. Andy himself provides other ways of describing the contrast between these 2 movements. And I prefer the distinction between an ecclesiology of strategic alliance and that of covenant, which Andy himself identifies on page 125. I recall from the days of the denominational consultation of 1996 that I and my companions in the Covenant group were immediately struck by a phrase used by Tom Houston in his address, which spoke of the need, in his view, for Baptists in the present day to make strategic alliances. We saw our talk about covenant as being the counterpoint to that idea. The church, whether manifest locally or in association or in union, was not just an alliance for certain strategic and pragmatic purposes, such as mission, but was being drawn together by the covenant maker, who is Christ. Even when others used the word covenant, we suspected that what was meant often was a strategic alliance. If I were to characterize two trends or movements, that would be the distinction I would draw: covenant or strategic alliance, not theology or denomination building. But Andy himself has suggested that. A second question is triggered not by the main text of the book, but by Stephen Holmes' preface to it. There he remarks that Baptist voices about either mission or covenant tend to assume that these are straightforward biblical concepts, where they are not. It's worth saying that the covenant group never thought it was espousing a theology of covenant that was simply justified by Scripture. As Andy points out, there was a strong sense that the concept of covenant had been shaped by Baptist tradition in the past. Our ancestors had introduced novel elements that were not simply in the Bible. The very notion of the covenant of the triune God with a local church exceeds biblical parameters. Andy suggests that in the Covenant Service 21, he says, for the first time it is stated that the making of covenant between church members was a development of the biblical concept of covenant, page 127. But in the report of the Doctrine and Worship Committee on the Church's responses to its Assembly and Council document, it had already asserted that, and I quote, the report was concerned to develop a new vision of covenant relationship for today, based on Scripture and on the insights of our Baptist forebears. And so, even beyond past Baptist tradition, the group was now extending concepts of covenant to cover a more Catholic understanding of the church, as well as the activity of God in society outside the church. The covenant group was well aware that it was offering a theology of covenant shaped by contemporary concerns, such as ecumenism, the multi-faith context, and an increasingly secular world. While it did see itself as retrieving a genuine element of Baptist identity which had been neglected, it was also self-consciously developing the idea of covenant for the present day. It has to be admitted, however, I think, looking back, that to communicate its vision to other Baptists, the group tended to stress the element of retrieval. Another question of historical judgment is Andy's fascinating suggestion that the Theological Renewal Group, or the Covenant Group, should have taken up the 1996 document called 5 Core Values for a Gospel People. This, he thinks, might have been the means of holding mission and covenant together in a meaningful way. And so, joining these two trends that he's analysing, he judges that neither myself nor Brian Hames make, he says, any mention of the core values in Tracts and Traces or on Being the Church or any other subsequent work. And so an opportunity was missed. That's page 133. I think it's worth pointing out that, as Andy himself notes elsewhere, the Covenant 21 service integrates the making of a covenant with the 5 core values, which are listed in the declaration called I serve as part of the service. Though Andy mentions that I was on the Covenant 21 preparation group, he may not know that I played a major part in the shaping of the service and wrote the sections on covenant that appear in the presentation pack. I agree that it's important to bring together the perspectives of covenant and the 5 core values, and I believe that Covenant 21 was the ideal vehicle to do this in, though I take his point that this should also have been done extensively elsewhere. He is right, I think, in his judgment here. I might add, however, that he's not quite right to say that I don't make mention anywhere else of 5 core values. In my published reply to the Methodist David Carter's review of Tracks and Traces, which Andy mentions, I write as follows, and I think it's still very much worth saying. Statements which place mission in a theological context will also win wide consent, as with the document approved by Council called 5 Core Values for a Gospel People, which has become a kind of manifesto for Baptist churches. This document also shows that Council can act creatively in reinterpreting Baptist tradition for the present. I hope Council goes on doing that. Now, these slight qualifications I ventured to make to Andy's account are, however, trifling in face of the achievement of the whole. He must be right that while the adoption of covenant language in the denomination has been widespread, covenant theology has had much less impact. I remain convinced that the idea of covenant has urgent importance, not only just for the shape of the church, but for cooperating with the activity of God outside the church, where God has many covenant relations of which we are scarcely aware. In my own thought, covenant has increasingly become an understanding that the whole universe exists in the fellowship of the triune God. As I wrote as early as Tracks and Traces, when conceived imaginatively, covenant is as wide as the world. Thank you for listening to my response, and I look forward very much to seeing what happens in the Q&A.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Paul. That's a perspective from somebody who is at the heart of the issues going on and the content of Andy's book. We turn now to somebody who approaches it from the outside, though not as a disinterested observer, but as somebody at the heart of Baptist life in Europe and beyond. We want to welcome Dr. Lina Toth. Lina comes from Lithuania, though when she's speaking English, you can sometimes detect a slight Merseyside accent because she was taught her English partly at Ibla in Budapest, and one of her teachers was a young English Baptist, Yvonne Froud, who spoke with quite a strong Merseyside accent. She came to us then in Prague as a student for the master's degree, did her doctorate at IBTS, served as my personal assistant, then as course leader in our course on applied theology, and ultimately became academic dean before moving to the Scottish Baptist College, where she currently serves as assistant principal. In this quinquennium, she is the chair of the Worship and Spirituality Commission of the Baptist World Alliance. Lina comes from a remarkable Lithuanian family, and here's a plug which hopefully will lighten Larry's heart. There is a story of her grandfather explained and told in this book, Exploring Baptist Origins. But Lina doesn't rest on the laurels of her grandfather and her family in Lithuania. She has established her own very significant place in world Baptist life as a thinker and theologian. So we invite Lina now to give her reactions to Andy's book. Lina, it's a pleasure to have you with us at this lunchtime seminar.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you for the introduction. I suspect the strongest accent you will hear is the Scottish one, which seems to have become a second nature for me before I knew it. Well, why has a Lithuanian residing in Scotland been asked to offer her reflections on a book that explores a recent episode in the life of the Baptist Union of Great Britain? I was not entirely sure, but I thought perhaps because she's a Lithuanian and serves a neighborly Baptist union, and so presumably brings an external perspective on the issues that Dr. Goodliff's book is concerned with. And that's how I've taken this invitation. Indeed, if we are to understand ourselves, we need the perspective of our outsiders, so to speak. And this is as true of ourselves as persons as it is of churches and denominations. But if I'm an outsider, then I'm of a peculiar kind, one who's never been directly part of the life of the Baptist Union of Great Britain, or BUGB, but one who happens to know many of the living subjects of this book. As they represent both streams, to use the main category employed in this volume, it has been fascinating to hear and see over the years their reflections and perspectives on the life of the Union, on what in their understanding constituted the core of the Baptist identity, and what to their minds were the key challenges which the Union had been facing in the period under the consideration. I will reflect on the role of oral and informal inputs later, but at this point, I'd simply observe that it is through their eyes and because of their at times quite divergent perspectives and their care and concern for the denomination that I became drawn to and interested in the life of this Baptist Union myself. Moreover, through my role at the Scottish Baptist College, which of course counts itself as one of the colleges of BUGB, there is a direct connection now to the life of this ecclesial body. Geographical and to some extent cultural distance can make relating a little more difficult at times, but the links, both institutional and personal, are long-standing, meaningful and fruitful. So if I am an outsider, then I'm a friendly one with a deep interest in this particular expression of church life. A couple more things need to be noted about the perspective with which I have engaged this work. One, for a good portion of my life, as mentioned, I have been privileged to relate to wider associational structures of Baptist life, such as the European Baptist Federation and the Baptist World Alliance. With Tony Peck here, however, I'll leave that aspect aside, except to know that for Baptists, translocal relationships can be particularly fraught with difficulties and often reflect rather divergent ecclesial suppositions. And second, the tiny Baptist union in which I started my life back in Lithuania and to which I still belong and contribute to, in many ways would reflect the same central issues that are identified in renewing a modern denomination, particularly in terms of the tension between mission and theological identity, and the debate about which one of these should be the organizing principle. But it also made me think about how much church life and denominational life is shaped by its key players and their particular life stories, their passions, their experiences, and indeed at times significant changes of perspective, if not outright conversions to a different theological vision. We get just a glimpse of some of these individual interests or experiences in this book, in such stories as Nigel Wright's interest in Anabaptism after the visit to that Mennonite community, or Douglas MacBain's befriending a Benedictine monk and becoming, somewhat surprisingly, a supporter of ecumenical relations extending beyond the evangelical circles. One's attitude to the union and union structures can also undergo a change, such as Nigel Wright's eventual self-description as of, quote, something of a denominationalist, unquote, compared to his starting point of critiquing the union from the fringes. In a different way, Rob Warner's story leads him from active involvement in mainstream and its aim to transform the union to disillusionment and re-embracing of Anglicanism. Again, it is not by chance that the author has described his project as a study of 4 of the most influential figures of the period. Though, of course, it's not always easy to work out who the most influential figures are in any particular grouping or period. The main players explored in this book and their life stories had an obvious impact on the life of the union, and as such, no doubt, deserve further scholarly attention. Reading through this volume, I could see the challenge of organizing the theological and practical concerns and the events of this short historical period. And I'd suggest that perhaps this challenge is particularly evident because of how short the period is, even though it is a key one, and how alive it still is in the memories of many. The need for the consideration of a larger period of history becomes apparent at a number of points, particularly on such issues as superintendency, which required a whole section on the history of superintendency. Indeed, the chapter on superintendency and associations is a reminder that other interpretative lenses could be applied. For example, an investigation of the theology and practice of Baptist leadership and leadership structures across different levels of organization. We get glimpses of such a lens in the occasional reference to specific leadership expectations in relation to such figures as the General Secretary of the Union, particularly colorfully expressed in the longing for a great man type of a leader, quote, marshalling and encouraging the troops as Mountbatten did in Burma. Such a picture was offered by one adherent of mainstream, and I'm sure many other mainstreamers would have opted for different imagery. Indeed, at least some of them have embodied a much more participatory and flexible model of leadership themselves. But a strategically political and assertive approach to leadership is quite evident, providing a contrast to a rather different vision of leadership offered by some other major figures considered here. So other hermeneutical lenses might have been possible, but this volume opts for 2 streams of thought, as we've heard. That of theological renewal and that of denominational or structural renewal, or expressed more theologically, 2 visions, one based on mission and therefore a missionary union, and another on covenant and therefore the union as a covenanted ecclesial body. Or, to put it in the language of fears and concerns, one concerned with church decline and the other with disregard for a deeply and theologically thinking faith in these swiftly changing times in which we live. As Goodliff rightfully notes, these were not neatly opposing streams, but they do convey a sense of tension in terms of their theology in general and ecclesiology in particular. Of course, life and ecclesial life is marked by complexity, and so categorizing the emphases in terms of mission and covenant can risk omitting important nuances. The limits of such categories are illustrated by the chapter on ecumenical concerns, which reports a significant overlap of the positions of the 2 streams. Whilst, as Goodliff notes, for stream 1, the natural interest was in developing ecumenical relationships with the evangelical landscape, there is also an account for a passionate argument for engaging with all Christian churches and a larger scale ecumenism. Goodliff notes a more functional approach to ecumenism on the side of stream 1 compared to commitment to unity in Christ as a source of theological renewal on the side of stream 2. But it is nevertheless a reminder of a rather intricate picture of convictions about the nature of the church, which the two streams lens doesn't quite explain on its own. Given the close proximity of this study to our present times, I wonder what kind of picture would emerge if the written sources explored in this volume would be supplemented by qualitative interviews and/or oral histories. Official papers are not on the same level as statistics, but they only ever tell us partial truth, don't they? As indeed is evident in Goodliff's observations. At one point, he notes that whilst the person might have been a co-author of a particular document, quote, it is not clear that he owned the description of the union within that particular document. Of course, memory and hindsight would have altered the views people might have held a few decades ago, making the picture even more wonderfully and exasperatingly complex. In any case, this certainly would be a really interesting continuation of the project, I think. What then are the conclusions that can be drawn for the Baptist life today, particularly on the translocal level? Here are some thoughts that I'm left with. The role that the evangelical identity, so significant for what Goodliff describes as stream 1, played in the story of Bugby is obvious. Again, it would be mirrored in the life of many other Baptist unions. As Andy helpfully notes, what happened in the 1980s was that a growing confident evangelicalism confronted a less confident sense of being Baptist. But the significant narrowing down of the terms evangelical and evangelicalism, particularly in recent years, seemed to confirm Brian Hames's old concern about party labels and the need for other ways of expressing commitment to, say, the key role of Scripture for our faith and practice. In the eyes of many, and increasingly so, evangelicalism is becoming too problematic for any constructive use. Indeed, given how it's been co-opted by particular groups in the United States of America, there is an increasing number of Baptists that see beyond redemption and instead have turned their attention to post-evangelical future. So it would be interesting to hear about the role these terms play in the life of the Union today and throughout its different associations. Talking of associations, I was also struck by what Andy identifies as the lack of a theology of Baptist translocal ministry, even though structures were significantly overhauled and some substantial theological groundwork had been offered. Surely there is an important issue being raised in his claim that the attempt to flatten the structures by giving much more power to regional associations and enlarging their territories in the process resulted in even more institutionalism, quote, in form and practice. And it is at this point that I absolutely would love to hear the current evaluation and reflection on the situation by those who had argued for these structural changes in relating and resourcing, for example. So how can Baptists do theology together beyond the level of the local church? How do they listen to each other and through each other? How can they seek guidance of the Spirit as a denomination? And how does change take place in a denomination and who brings it about? How do practical concerns and theological models interact in a context of a union seeking renewal? There are a lot of lessons here, not only for Bugby, Baptists, but also for Baptists and not Baptists elsewhere. Reflecting on our current times, which in terms of the church's life and witness can only be described as equally, if not more challenging than the last decade of the last century, I have been struck by a footnote relating an observation by Gethin Abraham Williams, the then editor of the Baptist Minister's Journal, requesting an article that would seek to address, quote, the uneasy relation between theological reflection and pragmatic activism, end quote, and suggesting that, quote, in a survival situation, theology appears to be a luxury we can no longer afford, end quote. This volume has given us plenty of thought, and if anything, it has further convinced me that in a time like ours, we simply cannot afford the luxury of ignoring our theology. But that will require paying attention to theology's different levels, operant as well as declared, reflected in our practice and people's personal stories, as well as preserved in documents and analyzed in further pieces of work, including the one we've had a pleasure of engaging with this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina, for those very helpful and thought-provoking comments, which I'm sure many people will want to pick up in the question time afterwards. It now gives me great pleasure to welcome our third panellist, Tony Peck. Tony is the General Secretary of the European Baptist Federation. He was raised in Scotland and first studied music and became a music teacher before then turning to study theology at Regent's Park College for the ministry. He served a group of churches in inner city Bradford at the same time as undertaking postgraduate study at the University of Leeds. Tony then became the Minister Secretary of the Yorkshire Baptist Association, and during the period covered by Andy's book, the 1990s, was very involved in the life of the Union, including chairing the Denominational Consultation Reference Group and also the International Committee. 6 years on the staff of Bristol Baptist College followed, where he was teaching in areas of missiology and pastoral theology and developing the college's lay training courses. Then in 2004, Tony was called to be General Secretary of EBF and will retire from that position later this year. He's written on aspects of Baptist life and identity, especially human rights and freedom of religion or belief. And we're really thrilled that you've been able to join us to give your response to Andy's book today. So over to you. Thank you, Tony.
Well, thank you very much, Christine, and thank you for your introduction. And it's good to see a lot of people I've known many years on this call today. Well, my first word must be one of appreciation of this fine study from Andy Goodliff. I must admit that when I learned that his doctoral work was dealing with this period in the story of our denomination, I did wonder whether perhaps it was yet too soon to achieve the necessary critical distance from it. But having read the book twice, actually, I find this a well-researched and compelling study of a crucial period in the life of our union that allows the main actors and the documents to speak for themselves. There is a judiciously balanced conclusion from Andy, with which I find myself largely in agreement. But I was unsure how to respond to the reading of this book. Do I think myself back 25 years to when I, along with others, was at the heart of the events that Andy describes? But at that point, I know I must guard against becoming defensive of my involvement in decisions taken then. So I've tried to read Andy's book in the here and now and to borrow his perspective as much as I can, to be open to looking objectively about the events he describes. And so for the remainder of this response, I want to make one overall observation, and then I want to engage with that part of Andy's conclusion where he highlights three key areas of tension which were around then and which he argues are still to some extent unresolved. The general point I want to make is to agree with Andy when he uses the word ferment for the period in Baptist life during the 1980s and 90s. Andy usefully highlights many of the reasons for this ferment. Looking back on it, it seems to me that one of the greatest causes of ferment was the impact and influence of the charismatic movement, and to a lesser extent, perhaps house church restorationism on all aspects of our life together. Though I think it's one that alarmed those in leadership in various parts of our union, who then tried to hold out against it as long as possible. Whatever we may think about it, charismatic renewal produced a whole new generation of local pastors and leaders who thought quite differently about worship, about ministry and leadership, and about Baptist institutional life, and who in some cases were even questioning the view of authority in the church under Christ, being based on the members gathered to discern the mind of Christ together. So ferment there certainly was, and Andy has documented the way in which, with the arrival of a new union leadership in 1990, in many ways more sympathetic to an evangelical charismatic outlook, change was being urged upon the union from several directions. But I think this is an important aspect of setting the scene. So let me move to the first of these tensions that Andy mentions in his conclusion, which he heads Conceiving the Union. I think Andy is right to identify different conceptions of the union from his stream 1 and stream 2, respectively missiological and theological, or perhaps more accurately, missiological or ecclesial, because I don't think it is true that theology was lacking in all missiological concepts of the union. But it was true that many respondents to the process of change, and I still have an unsorted pile of documents here at home, many respondents seemed content with the union being a missional resource for the churches and were unhappy about assigning any ecclesial significance to it. I don't share that view, and indeed in my present ministry in the European Baptist Federation, I've found it very helpful to articulate the ecclesial characteristics of the EBF and also to use the language of covenant as the basis of our being together rather than doctrinal unity. But a question that comes from this study and is still with us today is, what is the union? The BUGB constitution that was operative till recently stated right at the beginning that the union shall consist of the churches, associations of churches, colleges, other Baptist organizations, and personal members. In the latest constitution, the statement has dropped from the top of the page, but is still there under the clause on membership. Sometimes in Andy's discussion of the issue, it almost appears as if the union is something other than its constituent parts. And this I also remember, that in that time of intense debate, the union tended to be seen as those working in DIDCOT or involved in key committees, and it was sometimes added, who want to lord it over the local church. Perhaps the most, just as an aside, perhaps the most amusing comment that we received from a church was that the Baptist Union should pull up its socks and get down on its knees. But we did get these kind of comments. But the union, or Baptist Together, is of course all its members. And for me, that should be characterized by maximizing their participation in its life. Somewhere in his book, Andy mentions Nigel Wright's use of the work of Miroslav Volf on the church as image of the Trinity, particularly with reference to a more congregational type of church. Now, there are some ways in which I find Volf's overall model lacking, but one aspect resonated with me, and that is this element of participation, that a church that truly reflects the Trinity is one with an intense level of participation of its members in its life. Now, the 1990s was a time of intense participation in the life of the Union, not least at the denominational consultation itself. And in moving forward from there, the concept of covenant could have underpinned this by keeping alive the vision of the different parts of the Union to truly participate in shaping and determining its life together. Now, my observation from afar, it has to be said, in the life of its union is that, that participation in the life of the union by its members has decreased somewhat in the past 20 years, both in the union itself and in the association life. New government regulation about charity trustees and where decision-making should take place no doubt has contributed to this. But is it true, as I think John Colwell, I think I saw on the call here, asked in a recent article, that in some ways we've moved away from our emphasis on our participative gathering to seek the mind of Christ and become rather more Presbyterian in our governance and structure? So the question remains, what is the union today? I turn to Andy's second tension, which he calls the roles of union and associations. He helpfully charts the way in which, from the time of J.H. Shakespeare, the role of the associations, many of which were much older than the union, was rather unclear for much of the 20th century. And yet, the earlier histories of some of the associations probably provide a richer seam of what Andy Stream 2 would describe as an ecclesial reality based on covenant theology. They provide a richer seam for that than the union itself. This earlier reality of associating was not absent from all the discussions of the 1990s, and some of us hope that the associations might rediscover that role for themselves for a new day. I'm not able to say how it has worked out since then, but my sense is that it has been a rather mixed picture. The renewal of associating was by a long way at the top of the list of concerns emanating from the denominational consultation. I remember some meetings with the group that produced Relating and Resourcing when some radically different options were discussed. In the end, there came into being 13 regional associations, nearly half of whom were already existing, and so the others had the challenging task of bringing together several smaller associations, often with long and honourable histories of their own. And then we had regional teams appointed by the region and an end to union appointed superintendents and designated union areas. Now, this was controversial at the time, and I think it remains so today. I don't think that the decisions were all based on pragmatic considerations, but I would wish that some of that covenantal thinking might have found its way in, especially to illuminate the thorniest issue of all at the time, which was how those regional associations should relate to the union of which they are part. That seemed to become the ground of a lot of angst and shifting of power in the life of the union in the years that followed. And so I turn to the third tension, which Andy calls theology versus pragmatism. I'm glad, and this has been noted by other respondents, that Andy states more than once that these were probably not embraced by anyone as absolutes, but rather represent a continuum, with Andy identifying Stream 1 as being more driven by pragmatic mission concerns, and Stream 2 more concerned to build a future on carefully constructed theological foundations, especially that of covenant. The discovery by some of us in the 1980s of the missiological writings of Bosch, Newbigin, Kirk, and others, articulating a theological base for mission, were possibly too recent to influence the denominational consultation. though I discovered recently that I still had my copy of a substantial introduction to the theology of mission, drawing on insights from these writers and written for the Action in Mission program of the Union in 1990 by Nigel Wright and David Slater of Mainstream. Not all mission thinking was driven by pragmatism, though much undoubtedly was. On the theology side of the tension, Andy has some important questions to ask in this part of his conclusion on the place of theologians and scholars amongst Baptists, and what he quotes Brian Hames describing as a wariness to theology among us. Of course, there is truth in that I certainly recognize, but it raises for me an ongoing question, which was also raised by Lina, of how Baptists do theology together. Of course, utilizing the best theological minds among us, but finding a way to share this thinking much more widely around the table with those who might not see themselves as theologians, but are successfully basing their ministries on being reflective practitioners. If I can crystallize the question, and it is a theoretical one, why was there never a meeting together of the representatives of Stream 1 and Stream 2 in the period we are looking at? Perhaps there were more bridge people between the two streams than we realized at the time. Because it may have been in such meeting that what Andy calls a shared story and a common sense of belonging might have been fiercely debated, but discovered, or at least some common ground identified on the way to it. My final comment is that I remember being acutely aware at the time that first, we were not going to get everything right, and we did not, though we got some things right. And second, that this was not the end of a process so much as the beginning of a further journey of development and reform. For me, looking in on it from outside since then, that journey seems to have taken some surprising and sometimes disconcerting twists and turns, and it continues. Over 20 years on, and to utilize a saying of Kierkegaard, beloved of Ernest Payne, can Andy's backward glance to this critical period, with its plea for a theology of covenant and a concern for mission to be in a dynamic relationship with one another, can that yet help us to understand more clearly how to live the life of our Baptist community forward from here? Well, I pray that it might. Ecclesia semper reformanda.
Thank you very much, Tony, for your reflections. We've had three good responses there to Andy's work. Just a footnote on the chat. The Baptist Historical Society does have a working group on oral history, headed up by Ruth Goulbourne, and recently we have been doing some additional work in getting on with the task. So those of you who suggested that was something important to do, then please, the Historical Society has that as a particular project, and we're working on it. Without further ado, then I'm going to ask Andy to respond to the responses.
Thank you. I'm going to try and be brief so there's going to be good time for some conversation afterwards. Let me begin by saying thank you to Christine and the Centre for Baptist Studies, and to Keith and the Baptist Historical Society for jointly hosting this seminar and this book launch. It's a great feeling to have the book be given this attention and encouragement to people to read it for themselves. Let me next say thank you to Paul and Tony and Lina for giving their time to read, engage and respond to the book. This feels a little like a second Viva. Having Paul and Tony respond is a little daunting and also exciting, seeing as they both played a big part in the events the book describes. And Lina is someone whose thoughts I've admired for a while and is well placed to suggest whether the book has any merit also beyond British Baptists, English Baptists perhaps. The book is pretty much the thesis I submitted for my doctorate at University in St Andrews in 2018, and I thank Steve Holmes for his supervision throughout that process. My attention turned to the subject of Baptist life in the 1990s, partly because I had been someone in the 2000s involved in Baptist institutional life as a member of the Baptist Union Council, and was part of conversations that went on after 2002, where the book ends, and about the ongoing renewal, which hit a new crisis in 2012 in what was called the Futures process. I had a hunch that much of what happened in that later process was linked very much to the decisions taken at the end of the 1990s. Another reason for looking more closely at the decade was an opportunity to engage with the theological work which I have found so interesting and helpful, in particular the work of Paul Fiddes and Nigel Wright. Tony remarked whether we were still close to the period in question, and that might be true, but it felt there was enough of a distance that had been created to take a look. Let me make one more comment before I kind of try and return to some of the responses. The story I seek to tell in the book is a selected one. It seeks to explore the key institutional changes. Other stories could be told and will need to be told, and one particular might be termed a summons to be heard, reflecting on how voices, especially of women and people of colour, were working hard through the period to have a seat at the institutional table. And I look for perhaps myself and others to be telling some of those stories as well. So let me turn to the responses. I'm very grateful to my 3 respondents who have been very generous in their readings of the book and ask all the kinds of questions I hope the book raises and I would want to ask as well. At the end of the book, I conclude that the conversation about being Baptist is one that needs to continue and one that I believe needs to engage with history and tradition. Perhaps not every decade, at least among Baptists, can cope with the amount of theological reflection that took place as it did in the 1990s. Here was a flourishing of minds that wanted to think deeply about Baptist life. English Baptists have to go back to the 1960s for anything like an equivalent. This might be the beginning of a new tradition that every 20 years, Baptists engage in this kind of work. And as we enter the 2020s, perhaps it would initiate a new period of engaged thoughtfulness and reflection. I share Lina's suggestion that we cannot afford the luxury of ignoring our theology. In his response, Paul asked whether the 2 streams might reflect not just 2 different emphases, but 2 different theologies, one of covenant and one of strategic alliance. I think there is some merit in this distinction, and there is perhaps some evidence of the latter reflecting stream 1. Although I think this would have gone too far for some, picking up Lina, Keith's and Paul's complexity of the whole 2 streams separation. What it does reflect is the struggle we have to find the language to describe what was then called the Baptist Union and now labelled Baptist Together. And I think this comes from not being clear, and this is picking up on some of Tony's points, of what we think it is to be churches, associations and colleges in relationship and what we want it to be. And this is partly because we didn't start with a union, but it developed largely pragmatically and rarely with any theological understanding. And here I suggest the opportunity to grapple in the 1990s with these questions moved too quickly to allow the possibility of a shared understanding to emerge, what Leonard Chapman had called for a clear, coherent and widely accepted theology. Paul raises a second question about scripture and tradition, which I think relate to the comments Tony makes about how we as Baptists do theology together. Those offering a theology of covenant were working with scripture and tradition creatively, but this failed to find any real traction with a large with a large amount of people within the union, which I think was more of a misunderstanding rather than a straightforward rejection. Although Baptists love a proof text, so we can say this is that. I can only suggest we have to continue to take seriously a theologically educated ministry and to engage them to take seriously in encouraging theologically educated churches. One of my concerns about the present is I'm not sure in the union where intentional theological reflection is now being done, at least of the kind that we saw in the 1990s. It was not perfect, but I contend that the Doctrine and Worship Committee was a precious gift that we never appreciated enough. I'm glad Paul thinks there might have been an opportunity to work more with 5 core values. This document did seem to capture the imagination of many at its publication. I remember that we engaged with it in the congregation that I belonged to in Stevenage. Although I think there were problems with it, and some of them, the problems are ones that have been highlighted by Nigel Wright, There perhaps here was a starting point to build on. Sadly, five core values is already yesterday's news. The lesson, if there is one, might be that theological voices among Baptists might need to be alert to where a concept or an idea finds resonance with the union, meaning here more than Didcot, Tony, and see how it can be further explored and developed. Tony's response makes a helpful observation about a key cause of the ferment actually being the word that David Coffey used on numerous occasions, being the charismatic movement, in that it shook up Baptist life and perhaps caused some divisions as some embraced and others didn't. So David Coffey's presidential theme of build that bridge. My sense of Nigel and David is that while they were and are those who have been shaped by the charismatic movement, they were also consciously Baptist and alert to the broader liturgical Baptist tradition represented by others. In addition, they were not uncritical of the ways the charismatic movement developed with its emphasis on revival and signs and wonders. Tony is right in that there was, I think, a sea change in the broad makeup of ministers and churches from the late 1980s onwards that were more committed to a spring harvest style evangelical charismatic Christianity, which overwhelmed a very different kind of Baptist identity. Steve Holmes here is helpful in his work, Baptist Theology, in what he has to say about maximal and minimal accounts of Baptist life. There is perhaps the evidence to suggest that the minimal account, Baptist or evangelical of a believing baptism type, has come to increasingly dominate. This also picks up Lina's question around the place of evangelicalism among Baptists today. There has been, I think, a fracturing and some disillusion within evangelicalism, and this has affected Baptists. Tony comments that the level of the participation in the life of the union has decreased in the last 20 years. I would share that, and one of the questions is how much that was a result of the changes at the end of the 1990s, or how much of it was related to changes in charity law, and how much of it is an ongoing loss of denominational identity. One of the questions difficult to answer is how much churches felt or involved or interested in the deliberations of the 1990s, and how much have they ever felt involved or interested in the whole history of the union. The danger is perhaps a nostalgia about membership of the union or an engagement with associational life that was always pretty patchy and largely the concern of those who sat on different councils and bodies. I myself was largely ignorant of Baptist life beyond the local church until I was invited to be part of the union's Younger Leaders Forum way back in 2003, when I was young. It might be observed, like perhaps a large number of local church diaconates, that the makeup of council did not really change. Once you were on for a long time, and arguably it was an in club for a selected few. Here, the argument of the report, the nature of the assembly and the council by the Doctrine and Worship Committee, that a strong deliberate assembly is an important counterpoint to the work of the council. Let me say lastly that I recognise Lina's comment about what kind of story or picture might emerge if the argument of the book had relied more on the use of oral history or interviews. In my defence, while some people rewrite a PhD for publication and take many years, I wanted to get the thing published as soon as possible. It is offered for those to respond to whether I have been fair or accurate in the story I tell. I'm sure there are things perhaps not fully understood and mistakes made. Tony pointed one out to me that through the book I gave the wrong name to one group, and it's really frustrating me. What I hope is that there might be an engagement with the book from those who lived through the period, like Tony and Paul today, and that the engagement would not just be an historical one, but one that asked precisely the kind of questions my respondents have raised. Our history and decisions made in the past don't define us forever, but understanding them and engaging with them is vital to the activity of making sense of who we are today and who Christ might be summoning us to be tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy. That was a really helpful summation and an indicator of where we might go in the Q&A. I'd like now just to offer people a quick 4-minute stretch break, just to look away from the screen, go and grab a glass of water. We'll reconvene at 1:40. Please do, in the meantime, feel free to type your questions. We've already had a few in the chat so that we can make a swift start in a few moments. Okay, thank you. Okay, well, it's 1:40, so I'll call people to order now. And if Martin Hobgan is here, can I ask you to unmute and ask your question, please?
I am indeed here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy, for that and for the other contributions today. I was just wondering, Andy, what you thought might have been the outcome from the year 2000 onwards to the present day if the balance had been more towards the covenant stream rather than whatever we want to call the other stream.
That's a really good question, Martin. I wonder if it would have brought some challenges to the way that council and assembly, but also other ways of listening and deliberating worked. So we would have gone slower. And I wonder if we need to do that, particularly on issues which have become so potentially difficult for us at the moment. The sense of covenant and the little booklet on the way of trust, and that sense of trust amongst us, even where we don't always share the same view on something, would have been helpful. But yeah, I think it's a great question. And perhaps in 20 years' time, someone else, or maybe even me, will write a book on the last 20 years. Thank you, Martin.
Julian Gotobed, would you like to unmute and ask your question, please?
Thank you. Hi, Andy. To what extent do you think the preoccupations within Bugby you describe and interpret hindered the progress of informed engagement with racial justice issues that were being surfaced at the grassroots in Baptist life in that decade?
I think it's fair to say that there was so much else going on in the union, some of what I talk about in the book as well as other things, that yes, attention probably wasn't given. I think that also reflects on the issue of women in the institutional life. You know, I often reflected being on council at the end of 2009, 2000, you know, up to about 2012, where the issue of gender and the place of women in Baptist life was reaching a point where significant changes might have emerged, but the Baptist futures conversation took over, and I think we lost some ground on that, which we're only recovering now in the last 10 years. I think it is quite interesting that the racial justice began to take more prominence towards the end of the 1990s, and you know, it's 2002 when we had the first racial justice advisor appointed by the union in Wale, perhaps because other things had settled down or at least come to some kind of decision, so more time was taken. But yeah, there probably was just too much going on. If you look back, you know, I only talk about 4 things. The amount of other things that were going on in the union at the time that were on council's agenda, it was just amazing that that the officers of the union, as well as those heavily involved in running council, just could have held all those plates that was spinning. And it meant that other plates, other things that needed attention, perhaps weren't given to until later. And arguably, Julian, I think we might agree that we're still here 20 years on, still wrestling with what it means to engage with people of colour within the life of our union. Yeah, thank you.
John Colwell, could you ask your question, please?
Thank you, Andy. How would you respond to the view that over more recent years, responses to charity law in the appointment of trustees for union associations, churches and colleges has shifted us to an effective Presbyterianism that is a denial of our distinctive heritage and therefore a more profound challenge than these previous changes?
Well, that's provocative, John, from you.
Unusually so.
I think I share Tony's view that that our sense of belonging, our sense of connection, our sense of being involved has been lost largely at associational life and at union level as well. I think partly some of that is being pushed by finance, so a smaller assembly, which also meant a smaller council. I think a lot of it is perhaps to do with trustee law. I think actually a lot of it is, and I see this within our own churches, local churches, and John, I think you've written about actually this is a local church problem as well as a wider problem, is that we have been quite happy to hand over leadership to others. And you know, one of the sadnesses to me that the only deliberation that we've been doing in assembly, and it's not just the last 10 years, it's beyond that, was really, you know, who do we appoint as the treasurer? And I think that sense of being able to reflect together, to listen together. I think one of the best things that David and Keith did at the beginning, and another point during their time as General Secretary and Deputy General Secretary was listening days, that attempt to listen. And my own view, again, perhaps controversially, is that survey monkeys don't cut it in terms of proper listening.
Thank you, Andy. Curtis Freeman now has a question, which I wonder if all the panellists, as well as Andy, would like to respond to, because I think it relates to mission and doctrine. Curtis, would you like to pose your question, please?
Yes, thank you, Andy, and thank you for hosting this discussion. I look forward to reading the book. I haven't, but Andy and I have talked about it, and I wonder if you'd maybe talk wider about this shift to mission, because I don't think it's only a British phenomenon. I do see it here in the US. We've had this, that that doctrine divides, that mission unites, and it's a sort of pragmatic turn, but it really neglects the fact that even the call to mission is rooted in a deep sense of common life that I think the notion of covenant really calls us to attend to. So again, I just wonder if this is not just a British phenomenon, that it's a wider one.
Tony, go for it. I think it'd be interesting to hear your reflections from EBF, and maybe even my father, Paul Goodliff, from reflections from CTE as well as Paul and Lina.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Curtis. I think there's some truth in this, as I discover it also in the EBF. But I also think that, as I said in my response, that we have reflected more theologically, I think, as the church throughout the world on mission and the kind of missio Dei concept and what flowed from that, from people like Bosch and particularly people like Leslie Newbigin and others more recently, I think has helped us to root our mission in the if you like, the covenanted community of the church. So I see that since all this happened, I think at least there is the opportunity to bring these together. But I think then it seemed much more apart somehow.
Can I make a brief response
Yeah.
to that? Because in my response, this is one point I did bring up, to point out that in fact those who were concerned with covenant were also concerned for mission, especially the mission of God. I think there may be a difference between organizing the mission of the church and participating in the mission of God, as Bosch has told us very clearly. The whole point about covenant is that it's about the relatedness of God, not only to one small group, but as I said at the end of my piece, as wide as the world. And this is one of the ways, I think, in which those who were thinking about covenant developed the idea of covenant beyond simply what was there in the Baptist tradition, which did tend to be a somewhat enclosed group, in fact, necessarily because of the political constraints under which Baptists were living. Covenant tended to be a way of fencing in the community. What we were doing was developing covenant in terms of sharing in God's own relations with people throughout the world. And so I would want to say that a covenant theology is a mission theology, and always has been, the way it's been treated in recent years by those who've thought about it. It's intimately involved with the mission of the triune God. Yeah, but I'm very grateful to Curtis for flagging that up. Yeah.
As luck would have it, Andy's dad, Paul Goodliff, is the next in line as a questioner, so he might want to add any observations he has and then pose his second question, which is the one he included in the chat.
Thank you, Christine. I suppose the first thing to say is that I think this move to mission is not simply a Baptist phenomenon, either in this country or in the United States. It is also true of the widest canvas ecumenically. So the focus of the unity of the churches in Churches Together in England has been enhanced, I think, by a sense of shared work in mission. Now, whether that is simply pragmatism, or whether it is the fact that increasingly evangelicals, with their focus upon mission, have engaged with the ecumenical structures in a way that maybe 20 years ago they were not. I'm not altogether sure, but certainly I think that the sense of collaboration together when the churches are looking outwards to wider society, both in all 5 marks of mission, that deepens the ecumenical enterprise. In fact, the only covenant that is signed or owned within Churches Together in England is the covenant between the 6 presidents, and so that's the only place where there is any covenant. But the language that's used elsewhere is in pilgrimage together towards unity. And in that pilgrimage together towards unity, I think that the focus on mission is one of the ways which enables that community to walk together and sense there is some purpose in walking together. So that would be my comment on Curtis, your observation. But my observation from Andrew's book is just a personal one, really, and an observation that in all the changes that happen, often it's the players in the game that are important, and it's not always just the policy. Sometimes it's the players, and I sense that for those of us who were late joiners to the superintendent's board and who became then regional team leaders, we began with a focus on the union. We were employed by the union, and we turn my phone off. But whereas those were appointed as regional minister team leaders from 2000 onwards had their focus as the association, and in a sense that simple change, I think, in terms of association life and leadership of association life, might have moved the emphasis away from the uniting power of the union towards a more fragmented and dispersed relationship with the associations, and maybe that is reflective of part of the challenges we face today. And forgive me that my phone rang.
I think that's helpful. From my understanding, is when regional ministers were first being appointed, that there would be representatives of the union on those who were doing the interviewing. My sense is more recently that has been lost. So even that sense of union being a part of appointing regional ministers, and I think it would be, I would love to see, I don't think it will ever happen, but regional ministers reappointed by the union. I think that would be really helpful. I think Neil Brighton might be on this call. He once coined the phrase agents of Catholicity to talk about regional ministers, general superintendents. And I think that's a really helpful phrase. And I think that would be more helped if the link to union was there. I think Myra's got a question.
Hang on, there's Andrew Kleisner in front of Myra, and then Myra. So Andrew, would you like to unmute and ask your question, please?
No, I think people can read it on chat. Let's just go straight to Myra, thanks.
All right, okay. Myra, would you like to unmute, please?
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Thank you, Andy, ever so much. I really, really appreciate this study that you've done and everything that's been said. I suppose my bottom line is I think you hit upon something quite important, even though it may seem fractional or tangential when you highlight 5 core values as a lost gem. I remember even in 2002 at a council meeting, a significant figure in the body at that time stood up and said, 5 core values is passé. It's on the bookcase. I was shocked at the time, but it has come to be true that it has faded significantly. My other comment is listening to the discussion now. I wonder if there are echoes of the Brexit world, the trend within society of which we are all caught up, which has been ever and increasing through the second half of the 20th century and then really powered in the 21st. This sense of anti-structures, anti-center, distrust of leadership, and a kind of internal preoccupation, navel gazing, that too much focus on self is actually the seeds of self-destruction. And so if we ask, what do we need now? I would beg, please, not another review, certainly not every 20 years, not if it's going to mean more internal navel gazing. I think the answer, as 5 core values would suggest, is about engaging in sacrifice and service. And that in the process of sacrifice and service, engaging with the world in which we're called to live and move and breathe, that will teach us about covenant, not talking more about covenant, but learning how in the living of our relationships, we have revealed to us from the outside what covenant looks like.
I think, yes, Myra. I think in my response, I talked about part of the story that was going on in the 1990s was about a summons to be heard by more people. And I think we've seen that increasingly over the last 20 years. And I think, you know, where we are now in the next decade needs to increasingly be listening to those who have not been heard. But without forgetting the conversations around covenant and mission. I think you're right that perhaps it's almost a covenant happens as we work together and work in those ways of trust. But I think there are still questions about what it is to be union, which was what Tony was raising, and how we connect and relate, which is to do with about being heard. I also think I agree that we need to be a Baptist people who are looking more outwardly. And here I'll plug my friend Beth Allison, who is doing a weekly for the Joint Public Issues team, political engagement with electionary passages, in reminding us that we need to be a political people, not left or right, but after the politics of Jesus in that sense.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you everybody very much indeed. It's been great, and looking across the screen to see so many people who were participants in that phase in our history. A special thanks to Andy. You did the hard work of the research, the doctoral studies. You've got the benefit out of it, I guess, in having the Reverend Dr. Andrew, as your father would say, or Andy, as the rest of us would say, Goodliff, there in your ministry at Bellevue Baptist in Southend. Thanks to our 3 respondents, to Paul, to Tony, and to Lina. We're very grateful for you doing that work and raising issues amongst us. A couple, privilege of somebody co-chairing this event, a couple of points about it. I dare to believe, and I would argue it out if I could only get access to the Angus Library and the minutes again now, that the Doctrine and Worship Committee was always very carefully balanced by the Appointments Committee to have people from the 2 streams on it, and I make that assertion. I think I, for one, am very concerned that with the loss of that committee, your question, where is intentional theological reflection being done in Baptists Together, remains a profound one. The commentary going on about 5 core values, I may belong to a rather ancient Baptist church at Shipley in its attitudes, but we're currently running a baptismal group where 5 core values for a gospel people is the working text. So it hasn't died out everywhere quite yet. And I remember reading from a distance Paul's observations in council when things were happening with charity law and the forcing upon us of these small, narrow groups of trustees. And nobody else I can find in the records made that observation that our ecclesiology was being interfered with by government. I think some other traditions would not have stood for it in the way that we apparently have. And I was stuck out in the joys of wider Europe then, but it seems to me something happened then which affected our life, and it wasn't done by us, it was done by others, and that is worth a lot of study in the future. Well, there we are, enough soapbox stuff from an old Baptist disappearing down the plug hole here. But it's been a great time. We're going to keep our covenant commitment with all of you to finish at 2 o'clock. Thank you so much for participating. Read the book, join the Baptist Historical Society, get involved in the Oral History Project, keep tuning in to the work of the Centre for Baptist Studies at Regent's Park, and have a good afternoon. God bless you all.